Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Next, to interpolate, I move that we recognize the gentleman from the 1st District of Agusan del Norte, Congressman Lawrence Fortun.
The gentleman from the 1st District of Agusan del Norte, Honorable Lawrence Fortun, is recognized to interpolate the good sponsor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the distinguished sponsor willing to answer a few questions on interpellation?
Yes, Your Honor. Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, unang tanong lang po. The franchise of ABS-CBN had expired on May 4 this year. In other words, there is no more an existing franchise to speak of. Now, we are trying to legislate a franchise for ABS-CBN. May I know, Mr. Speaker, the nature of the measure? Is this one of grant of a new franchise, or is this a renewal of a franchise?
It's basically, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, a grant of a provisional franchise, meaning a 5-month franchise for ABS while we are hearing the issue of whether this is a renewal or a new franchise. Again, is subject to debate. At this point, the rationale in filing this bill is really for ABS to be able to operate while we are hearing. Again, the distinguished gentleman from Agusan's point is very noteworthy. Maganda po. Meron school of thought na sinasabi na since expired na yan, dapat new franchise na yan. Hindi niya yung renewal. But ang tanong nga, kung wala naman new bill na final, hindi madidinig yan. So at this point, we stand by what we filed. This is a bill that will grant a provisional franchise, temporary for 5 months. Yung the issue of renewal or new, I think that has to be resolved at a later time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I ask this, thank you, Mr. Speaker, thank you, distinguished sponsor. I ask the question, Mr. Speaker, because this is material to the issue of whether or not the frequency of ABS-CBN can be assigned already to another network. If this is one of renewal, then in the meantime that the renewal bill is still being heard, there cannot be any assignment of the frequency to any other network. But if this is for a new franchise, pending issuance of a new franchise, in the meantime, the frequency can actually be assigned already to another network. So, may I ask, Mr. Speaker, what protection does ABS-CBN have from the possibility of its current frequency being assigned to another network in the meantime that the franchise bills, whether one of renewal or a new franchise, are still being heard in the House of Representatives?
Mr. Speaker, napakaganda po ng punto ng ating kagalang-galang na Congressman, si Lo. Importante po yan na marinig ng publiko because if I personally say that this is a new renewal, meaning hindi dapat i-assign ng frequency. Pero I cannot answer for the NTC because in an open hearing, under oath, sinabi nila they will renew. Because at this point, even if Congress says this is a renewal and NTC thinks it's a new franchise and they can give away the frequency, we are a separate branch of government, which was already shown by the non-issuance or the issuance of the NTC of the cease and desist. So at this point, if my stand is still a renewal, with regard to the question of the Honorable distinguished gentleman from Agusan, what protection, I cannot answer for NTC, definitely. Because if I think this is a renewal, it does not change the fact that NTC can decide that it's a new franchise and give away the frequency, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Yun lang po ang kinakabahala ko because NTC, at this point, as far as we are concerned, cannot really be trusted. They committed to us in a committee hearing under oath that they would issue a provisional permit for ABS-CBN. And aside from that commitment, Mr. Speaker, they also committed that leading to the issuance of the provisional authority, they would from time to time update the House of Representatives of any development relative to the provisional authority. And yet, from March 10 up to May 4, we never heard from NTC. And they surprised us on May 5 with the issuance of a cease and desist order. Kaya parang nakakatakot, hindi natin mapagkakatiwalaan dahil bagamat under oath nilang binitawan ang kanilang commitment, they reneged on that commitment in wanton disregard of what they told us in that committee hearing of the Committee on Legislative Franchises. As in wanton disregard. Sana naman, if they had a change of heart midstream, they should have told us ahead of time that contrary to our earlier commitment, after consultation with our legal department, we could not anymore assure you of a provisional authority for ABS-CBN because the legal opinion of our lawyers are to the contrary. And yet, ginulantang tayo, no? Kaya tinatanong ko to, Mr. Speaker, because there might be a possibility that at the time that ABS-CBN is granted a franchise, the frequency that was assigned to them may no longer be available. And I will not belabor this, Mr. Speaker, because as you said, you cannot answer for NTC. Another question, Mr. Speaker. Kailan po ba natin masasabing ang isang prangkisa ay provisional? For example, if we give ABS-CBN not the 25-year franchise that is usually given to all other networks that apply for franchises in the House of Representatives. If we give them, for instance, a 2-year franchise, is this provisional or a regular franchise already?
A 2-year franchise can be considered a provisional franchise because as mentioned earlier, yung Bolinao Electronics Corporation was granted a temporary permit to operate June 14, 1950 na wala ngang time period that time. May condition lang that it will be given a permanent one if they meet following conditions. So it is the prerogative of Congress kung ano pong time frame. As long as we follow the constitutional requirement, Congress has the prerogative to give 3, 5, 6, up to 25 years, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Can we not simply call it, Mr. Speaker, a franchise with a shorter period?
Magandang punto yan. We are open for discussion. That can be discussed at the right time during the hearing or the period of amendments, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor. At this point, since we reverted back to the second reading, everything is open at this point for discussion, for manifestation, for amendments in due time. At the end of the day, gusto natin pakita sa publiko na habang gusto natin bigyan ng priority o pabilisin ang pandinig at pagdesisyon na ginawa nga natin for first and second, kailangan rin talagang marinig at lalong marinig pa ang iba't ibang kasama natin dito sa Kongreso na nakiusap na pagbigyan silang magpa-interpellate, pagbigyan silang mag-propose ng further amendments. Kaya nga po, ang leadership of the House, kami po, ay na principal authors, ay pumayag na po na i-revert back for second reading and open the floor for further interpellations, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, distinguished sponsor. Since we are now on second reading again, Mr. Speaker, and we would reach the point where we have to introduce amendments to the pending bill, is the distinguished sponsor open to an amendment of the period from instead of up to October 31, 2020, this year, to 25 years, as earlier brought up by our distinguished chairman of the Committee on Appropriations, Congressman Eric Yap.
Tama po kayo. Nag-manifest po si Congressman Chairman Eric Yap. And siguro, maybe we can hear from the distinguished gentleman from Agusan if he wants to propose an amendment at the right time, na imbis na October 31, 2020, gawin ng October 31, 2045, thereby granting a 25-year franchise. Open po kami dyan. Importante talaga na tayo, may due process, pinapakinggan lahat. Siguro, the distinguished gentleman from Agusan filed a bill, I think, if I'm not mistaken, for a 25-year franchise. We're open for suggestion, for amendment at the right time, provided, again, that dapat talaga magkaroon ng malawakang hearing. Ang gusto ko po mangyari as the sponsor of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, practical question lang po. Kasi tinitingnan din natin yung urgency ng resumption of operations of the network because of the 11,000 workers or so that have been displaced in the middle of a pandemic. And we want to address that, Mr. Speaker. Na sana naman makabalik sila sa trabaho dahil napakaraming pamilya po ito. 11,000 breadwinners translate to 11,000 families affected by the displacement in the middle of a pandemic. So ang gusto kong itanong, if ang magiging direksyon po natin ay 25-year franchise, will this entail longer process, like referring back the measure to the Committee on Legislative Franchises for further hearings, because this is already for a franchise of 25 years? Or will the 25-year franchise, after amendments, be approved by the plenary already and will no longer undergo the same procedure in the Committee on Legislative Franchises? Kasi kung tatagal po, halimbawa tatagal pa ng ilang buwan hanggang October, napakatagal pong walang trabaho yung 11,000 na yon. It might be helpful to give a shorter franchise instead and just consider that longer period of 25 years in the meantime that the shorter franchise is effective.
Tama po yan. In fact, ang intention ng pag-file namin nito ay mabigyan ng provisional franchise for until October so that they can operate and hindi mawala ng trabaho itong 11,000 habang dinidinig. However, since binalik na to sa second reading, hindi naman po kami ang may gusto ng ibalik nito. Some members may nag-question nga na may constitutional defect. We opened the floor for further amendments. So at this point, ako, ulitin ko, yung gusto namin na makapag-operate sila habang hinihir. But ngayon, mukhang marami na pong schools of thought. Mayroong gustong bigyan ng provisional franchise hanggang October, mayroong gusto na hanggang 2021, mayroong may gusto ng 2022, mayroong ay nag-iisip na 2045 na or 25 years. So, at this point, siguro, we can decide that during the period of amendments, and we want to hear from the majority of our members kung ano na talaga on how we can move forward. What's important is pinapakinggan na, naririnig na ng taong bayan ang both pro and against, mga issues to help us decide. I think at this point, yan ang importante. Maraming salamat, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, distinguished sponsor, if we grant a shorter franchise of until October 2020 or maybe a year or two, not the 25 years, are we looking at this week the approval on second reading of the measure and on third reading by next week, probably Monday?
I cannot speak for the majority, no? Basta ako, yung sinecond reading namin to last week, akala namin na uusad na to. Akala namin na complying with the 3-day rule in the Constitution na ma-third reading na para ma-forward na sa Senado. Pero ngayon makikita mo, medyo umiiba po ang desisyon ng ating mga miyembro. Narinig mo naman si D.S. Marcoleta, gusto niya isang malawakang hearing. Si Chairman Eric Yap ng Appropriation, nag-file ng resolution ng malawakang investigasyon at gusto na rin niyang 25 years ang dingigin. Meron naman na gustong 2021, 22. So at this point, Your Honor, I cannot answer for the majority. I think we should have a majority caucus and decide how to move forward starting today after the changes and various interpellations and manifestations expressed by our members. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, District Sponsor. At any rate, at the proper time, Mr. Speaker, this representation considers proposing a 25-year franchise instead of until October 31, 2020. Just another manifestation, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, on the issue of franchise. I tried to make a little research and came to a conclusion that the requirement of legislative action for the grant of franchises, especially in this case, franchise for ABS-CBN, is not actually a constitutional requirement. There is no provision in the Constitution that requires that there should be legislative grant of franchise. It is actually a power that is provided for by law. In other words, if we are asked, is there really a constitutional requirement? No. Unless there is a law, there is no need for a legislative franchise. And interestingly, Mr. Speaker, it appears that there is really no law that specifically grants Congress the power to grant legislative franchises to TV networks. Because the law that was applied by the Supreme Court was the law referring to grant of franchises to radio networks. And in one case, the Supreme Court said the law also applies to television. Mr. Speaker, I had contemplated on this even prior to the issue of the ABS-CBN's renewal of franchise. Contemplated on filing a bill removing from Congress the power to grant legislative franchises to public utilities and public services. Simply because it's an added burden. It's an added layer in the bureaucratic requirements. But the experience, Mr. Speaker, that we had with NTC gave me a change of heart because it appears that retaining the power to grant franchises in Congress serves as a mechanism for checks and balance. Kasi kung sa isang ahensya na lang, tulad ng nangyari sa NTC, parang napaka-powerful na nila at wala ng checks and balance. I think it's appropriate that we retain that power in Congress, no, by retaining legal requirements and, in fact, strengthening the legal requirements for legislative franchises for public services and public utilities. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, distinguished sponsor, sabi ni Speaker kanina, Mr. Speaker, buti na academic na, pero gusto ko lang emphasize just for a minute that I beg to disagree that holding first and second readings on the same day is unconstitutional. The Constitution, I think, contemplates a situation where a bill is referred in the regular course to a regular committee, like the Committee on Legislative Franchises. Because the rationale under the Constitution, as ruled by the Supreme Court in one case, Kida versus the Senate of the Philippines, nasabi ng Supreme Court, ang rationale po nito ay upang the rest of the members of the House are duly informed of what transpired in the committee. So if this was referred to the regular committee, only the members of the committee had prior notice or had notice of what transpired there. The rest of the members of the House do not have notice. But in our case, in the case of House Bill 6732, this was referred to and considered by the Committee of the Whole, in which case everybody participated or had the opportunity to participate in the deliberation of the bill at the committee level, in which case first and second reading may already be conducted on the same day. What cannot be compromised, Mr. Speaker, is the third reading on a separate day because the requirement in the Constitution is that there should be distribution of copies of the bill in its final form to all members 3 days before the passage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, distinguished sponsor.